So today I'm going to go over the ancient world, and that includes several different locations throughout the world. Um, we're going to start with the ancient Egyptian artwork, and we'll just move through each one. So the ancient Egyptian artwork is actually broken down into three different stages of the time period. And you're going to see that with a couple of them. They're going to be broken down into different stages. But I'm going to briefly go over the stages. That's not really the focal point. We're really going to focus on the human body again within the works, the different cultures, how they depict the human body, the use of the human body within the works. And it's really, this one's going to be more in depth than the last PowerPoint by a lot. However, again, these ancient works and the beginning of the artwork is really just a build up to contemporary works, and the reason why contemporary works are so infatuated with the human body, why they use the human body in such a manner, and this really brings out their inspiration. So, just a little bit of background before we dive into the Palette of Narmer. The ancient Egyptian world, in particular, was broken down into different stages, and we're going to start with the Old Kingdom of Egypt. Now, the Old Kingdom of Egypt, it's really incredible because we get to see a written language. The hieroglyphics get to tell us stories. We get to learn about the culture, the religions, the lifestyle of back then and what was going on. Unlike the Paleolithic period, where we were kind of guessing what kind of purpose everything held, this time we actually get to dive in and see and physically understand what all of this work meant. And we're going to start with the Old Kingdom, like I said, which was broken down into Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. So there were two different sort of sections in Egypt, in particular around the Nile, that didn't get along. They weren't coexisting. Upper Egypt was in Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt. Never the twain shall meet. So on this palette, we get to see the story, not the whole story, just kind of really the ending of the story of King Narmer, who was from Upper Egypt, which we can tell by his crown. Him taking over Lower Egypt and that victory over Lower Egypt. Now, if we look at the human body in this, he's in what's called a composite pose. And the composite pose for the Egyptians held a lot of meaning. And that was to demonstrate the hierarchy. So if a human body represented in the works was in a composite pose, it actually meant that that figure holds a significant purpose. It holds a significant status. So they weren't just kind of mutilating the human body's pose inaccurately uh, just for fun or for aesthetic reasons. It helped them to identify who was important. And not only that, but also the size of the person showed a significance to the meaning. And here, the king, he is on the left tablet. He is the biggest figure with his crown, and he is actually the figure that he is attacking or murdering, is actually the king of Lower Egypt. And we know this because he is also in a very similar composite pose. And if he were to stand, he is in the exact same size category as Narman the King. Now, Narman the King, he doesn't have his shoes on because he's on sacred ground while he does this, when he does his victory over Lower Egypt. But we see a figure behind him also in composite pose, which is composite pose is the head is in profile, the shoulders are facing us onward, and the legs are also in profile in motion. And the figure behind him holding his sandals is probably his second in command or another significant man within his his rule, and he's holding his sandals for him because what we've learned is that they didn't wear sandals on sacred ground. Now we also know that it's sacred ground because the god is there. He's in the falcon, the falcon with the human arm. He is the god Horus, which was a very important god for them during this time. The gods are going to shift as we continue, but I'll get into that later. But he's shown with a human arm, which is very interesting because a lot of times they'll actually combine the human body with animals to depict their gods. And we see this for a couple of different scenarios, which I'll go over again later. And on the right side of the tablet, so we're gonna shift over to the right side of the tablet because this is where we see a similarity between the Paleolithic, or what we assume happened in the Paleolithic time period, to the ancient works, and that is the fact that not only does it hold a symbolism or a story or a purpose within their religion or lives, but it also holds a function in relation to the human body. And we see this within the two animal figures that have their necks intertwined, and that creates this little circle. And what we have learned from that wonderful little circle carved onto this palette is that that was the area in which they crushed up the powder to make the eye makeup that they wore. So this not only tells a story and depicts the human body to create a hierarchy, but it also holds a function within the human body. And it really demonstrates what is going to be going on during these ancient times. That everything artistic holds a function as well as being a work of art. And everything has, we begin to see that everything has a symbol, everything has a purpose. It means something. It's not just us guessing in the dark now, it actually tells us a story. So we're going to move on, and this will be really interesting because this is where we get to see sort of their not really religion, but their beliefs. And they definitely believed in an afterlife, and this is demonstrated in a lot of sculptures that we find within the tombs, and also the mummifications of the bodies, which we will also get into. Now, the reason why they actually mummify the bodies and create these statues that I'm about to discuss is because they believed in a life force, and it's kind of like a spirit, but it's not exactly a spirit, and they called it the Ka. So the Ka is a human's life force, and the Ka continued on after death. So the person would die, and their life force would continue on, but their life force needed something to inhabit. It wasn't free in a way. It was never allowed to be free. It needed a body. So a lot of times the Egyptians would try to mummify the body so it could remain there, or they would create a statue for the Ka to inhabit. And then, and this is also why in the tombs they had a lot of the objects that the person liked during life, because then the Ka who inhabited the statue or the mummified body could then enjoy and partake in activities that the person did while alive. So this life force would continue to enjoy festivities that the person enjoyed while they were alive. This was the continuation of the human who passed away. And one of the pieces that we're actually going to be looking at is the representation of Khafre. And he was around the 4th dynasty. So it does get broken up into dynasties, but I'm not really going to go into that. That's not our focal point. So his in particular, the reason why I'm sort of focusing on his is because it was the standard for a couple of others. And his sons does look a little bit different, but basically this is what we're looking at for the life force's home base. Now, it was carved out of diorite, which is the hardest stone to carve. But it was really important that they use this because it was also the hardest stone, which meant that it would last longer. It also, it was imported from Nubia, which the reason why they picked it, or the reason why they would import it to make these sculptures, was also because of its blue quality, which blue, as we see from the hieroglyphics, was often represent of Horus, the god. So the main god. They had a couple, but the main one that's important, which if you see the falcon is actually behind his head in this, you can't really see from this angle, but the falcon is actually behind him, and again, that's to show that the god is with him, and this stone, when light is shown on it, radiates blue and looks blue. So it was just to emphasize again that the god is with him. And that's important because, as we can see by his garb, with the cloth hat, the fake beard, the kilt in a way, or the garb, he was, as we can see, a very important figure, a pharaoh, actually. And these statues weren't made to be identical to the human being that passed away. These statues were to represent the human being that passed away. It was just a place that the life force could identify with. So he's depicted in a way at his peak. His body is physically fit. It's all tucked together to show his strength in ruling. And that's actually why his one hand is clenched like a fist. So here, again, the statue of the human body, it's not realistic. It's not just there for decorative meaning. It has a purpose. It has a function. It's idealistic in nature. And it's representative. It's very symbolic. So we're breaking down the human body into function and symbolism. That's essentially what is happening in the Egyptian works. So, still within the Old Kingdom, we see figures that weren't as, they were still significant, but they weren't as high up on the hierarchy. Again, these figures were to hold the life force. And this one is of a scribe. Now, we know that it's of a scribe mostly because of him holding the papyrus, or the paper, that's half unrolled. And what we assumed would be in the other hand is the writing instrument. And as we can see, because he's what they perceived as a lesser figure, he's more realistic. He's less idealized. So this one, yes, it holds a function, but it has less symbolism behind it. It's more to the point, exactly what you see. His body is not romanticized in a way. It demonstrates a man who has not done too much physical labor throughout his life. It demonstrates his actual age. His hair is portrayed in a different way. It's more realistic to what he probably actually looked like when he was alive. And it also demonstrates the job in which he was required to partake in while he was alive. Now, the Middle Kingdom, I'm kind of gonna pass over a little bit, and it's nothing against the Middle Kingdom. It's just it's a little bit of a confusing time for Egyptian art, and it's not. It doesn't really break canon, which is the composite pose for higher ups and that kind of structure. However, it does. It kind of takes a step forward in regards to, we'll see a lot of royalty and those figures kind of look more realistic, more human. They'll show a lot more emotion, which they weren't shown in the earlier works. But once we get into the New Kingdom, it takes that step back. It goes back to that kind of structured format for the human body. And this picture in particular, head of Senusret III, was actually it's his head, unfortunately. Most of the sculpture actually got destroyed, and it got destroyed again, where it's really just his face left. But it actually shows more expression within the eyes of sort of this sorrow, and we actually get to see the one kind of fun fact about the Middle Kingdom that I will go over is we get to hear from the actual artists who are creating these works, which was never mentioned in other ancient works or beforehand, obviously. There's actually one piece in particular. It's not relative to the human body, but it's just kind of like a fun fact. The artist actually sort of signed it in a way, claiming that what it reads is, "I am an artist who excels in my art, a man above the common herd in knowledge. I know the proper attitude for a statue of a man. I know how a woman holds herself, and how a spearman lifts his arm. There is no man famous for his knowledge other than I myself and my oldest son." So, little arrogant the artists are, I think, but just a little fun fact. We're going to move into the New Kingdom now, which will again just kind of reiterate a lot of what we've been seeing. But towards the end of the New Kingdom, it's going to be really interesting because there's going to be this huge change in not just the human body, but what's actually what's occurring for the ancient Egyptian civilization. So now we have entered into the New Kingdom, and just a couple of, I guess, fun fact backgrounds about the sculpture before we actually dive into the body of it. So Hatshepsut, she's a woman, which is interesting because in this sculpture, well, I'm gonna get ahead of myself. I don't want to do that. So her husband, he died before their son could actually become of age to rule. So what happened is Hatshepsut, being the queen, she took over and ruled as emperor until her son was old enough, and then she actually remained emperor while her son was old enough, and they kind of co-ruled together. Now, she is a very significant figure because she has a very lavishing, very interesting temple, but I'm not really going to go over that. She was a very significant figure for the Egyptian culture. Huge economy build during this time period. A lot of trade started happening more so than before. It was a interesting time for the Egyptian civilization during her rule, and she is so significant to the civilization that they actually depict her a lot of times as a man. Because of again, like I said, in previous slides, they have a canon, they have a certain set of rules for depicting royalty or hierarchy of figures, and in order to demonstrate that she was powerful and important, they just applied the canon to her. So the peak of physical fitness for a man was put on her body. The false beard with the headdress and the kilt was applied to her statues. Um, Sometimes she is obviously depicted as a woman, which is why we actually know a lot about her, and that she was a woman. But this is her, I guess, life force statue within her temple, and it's just so interesting to see this woman depicted as a man to represent her status within the culture. And again, we see the arms tight together, we see the whole body structured together, and the reason why is because it's to demonstrate her rule. So much like Khafre, her entire body is a symbol. It's a representation. And her rule was so significant and powerful, and she was so strong in her ruling that they wanted to depict her in a strong, sturdy, not only body but pose. And the two jars that she's holding, obviously, they were they held different organs for the mummification. But again, it's a format. It's a structure. It's a symbolism. It's not realistic. It's not humanistic. It's romanticized. So we see this repetition within the ancient world, and when we move on to different civilizations, we're going to see a different canon for their structure and representation of the human body. So this is kind of an interesting, much like the Middle Kingdom, an interesting point of Egyptian work. And the reason why is because Akhenaten, who's originally called Amenhotep, but he changes his name later. He kind of comes in and changes everything. He changes the art style, he changes the religion, he changes everything that we know about Egyptian artwork and Egyptian lifestyle. He goes from having all of these gods and goddesses to saying, no, 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 there is only one God, and he is the sun god, and he produces rays of light, and this is who we are going to follow now. And, there's a lot of discussion behind this figure in particular, the figure of Akhenaten, and the reason why is because people believed that because he did this, because he changed their lifestyles and uprooted everything, a lot of the depictions of him were actually in a negative connotation. So they weren't in favor of him. That's why they gave him this slender face. That's why he has a belly. He has thin arms. He has this feminine sort of hourglass shape. He's depicted in a much weaker way than previous pharaohs or kings of the Egyptian rule. And a lot of people believe that they depicted him in a feminine way and in a non idealized way because they didn't like him and they wanted to show him as a weak human being, which is very insulting to women. But that would be your depiction of a weak person. But later on, a lot of scholars, they're kind of up in discussion about whether or not it's actually depicting a weak individual or if Akhenaten, like Hatshepsut, was actually a female ruler. So it's interesting because the human body here was often thought as a representation of a failed or disliked pharaoh, but it could be an actual realistic representation of the pharaoh's body. So we see this sort of shift in the human body and its role. But either way, there's a change in the Egyptian structure as to what's happening with the human body and its purpose within art. So after Akhenaten comes his son, Tutankhamun, who's also known as King Tut. So King Tut dies very young. He doesn't really get to rule very long at all. But the significant thing about his rule is that he goes, no, my father was wrong. I'm going to get rid of his one god. I'm going to get rid of his new art style. I'm going to get rid of everything that he represents. And we're going to abolish it and go back to the olden ways. So a lot of the ancient Egyptian work is kind of this tug of war between we need this representation of art to demonstrate the hierarchy to, hey, let's try something new, which it never really fully took on until later, the newer artwork. But King Tut, he goes back to the origin. Now, so the origin, I'm getting ahead of myself. The significance of King Tut is that his funerary home was actually the most lavishing and most informative in what they found, even though he died so young. So there was a lot of jewels, there was a lot of furniture, there was just a lot going on in his tomb. And the tomb talked a lot about who they were alive. And the funerary masks, they were to represent who they were alive. It was to sort of encase the mummified body, which would hold the Ka, which we talked about earlier, or the life force. So, just a little backstory on what they kind of believed, just for fun. Is that the funerary practice revolved around Osiris. So he was a he was a death god, and the dead would undergo this sort of like last judgment. They had two tests demonstrated by Osiris, and they were supervised by the jackal-headed god Anubis. which I'm sure a lot of people have seen that in Egyptian artwork. Anyway, the deceased were questioned by the deities, and it was questioned about their life while they were alive. So their life force, their ka, was kind of like put through this judgment, where several of the gods would convene and basically say, "All right, life force, let's see where you belong." Um, and uh, their their hearts were sort of the symbol, or what the Egyptians believed was the symbol of the Ka, or the life force. Um, and this heart would be weighed in a scale against an ostrich feather. And the the symbol of the ostrich feather with the scales was to represent um, the goddess of truth, which was Maat. And a monster would actually sit next to the scale. Ammit, that was the name of the creature, and Ammit, it basically stands for eater of the dead. Um, it weighted by the scale, because if the scale tipped in a way that was that said that the life force lived a negative life, the Ammit would devour the life force. If Ammit did not devour the life force and the soul showed a good life, the life force would then reside within the tombs. So this is also where the Book of the Dead kind of comes into play, because there were a lot of things in the Book of the Dead to sort of tip the scales in the favor of the person, so they wouldn't get devoured and would get an afterlife. But that's just kind of like a side story. Going back to the actual art, we see a very lavished kind of expensive, idealized piece of work that again holds a function as well as being an artistic symbol. So it's kind of, it keeps coming back and keeps coming back and keeps coming back in the ancient Egyptian work, that it's not just a piece of work hanging up on the wall. It holds a purpose. It holds a meaning. It holds a symbolism. And again, we see the false beard, the headdress, the appropriate garb for a pharaoh. All of these tell us what kind of life he lived, even though it was short. So that's kind of the end of the ancient Egyptian works. A little bit in the much later Egyptian works, you actually begin to see some Roman influence when Cleopatra kind of passes away and the Romans kind of invade, and all this history starts to take place. You do see on the mummified bodies, instead of this idealized, beautiful headdress, they actually paint onto the mummified corpses. So again, it's this tug of war between new and old, between tradition and exploration, between symbolism and functionality. So we're going to move into the next civilization. much like the Egyptian work, we're going to see in the ancient Greek work a canon, which, again, a canon is just a format or a style known for a time period or era. And the Greek canon it's going to look different from the Egyptian canon. The sculptures are going to be significantly different, but the work on the vases it's going to be mostly in profiles. It's not really going to be face on when you see a character on a vase. Again, it tells a story, much like the Egyptians, and also holds a function. Now, their functionality was more for holding things, for pouring wine, that kind of functionality, holding water, food, cookware, that kind of thing. Whereas the Egyptian functionality was more really for religious purposes, for ceremonial purposes, but both hold a function, both hold a story or tell a story. But we're going to be focusing mostly on the sculptures of the ancient Greek work. A lot of the ancient Greek work, there's a lot about ancient Greek artwork, and if you're interested in that, I definitely suggest looking into it because it's truly abundant in material. But because we're focusing on just the human body, we're going to really zone in on a couple of pieces, especially just seeing, coming from the ancient Egyptian world, moving into the ancient Greek world, we're going to see that a huge difference from ancient world to ancient world. So we're going to go straight into the sculptures. And again, much like the Egyptian world, this is also broken down into time periods, but the time periods aren't too significant. It just marks a lot of changes within the artwork. So this should look pretty familiar. Not too familiar though. But if you remember the woman of Venedorf, it will look very similar to that, which is pretty interesting. Now, the ancient Greek work, it's going to shift dramatically. So unlike the Egyptian work that tries to really, it tries something new, goes back to the original, tries something new, goes back to the original. This one's going to really get outside of its comfort zone. But the earlier works, especially on the Cycladic islands, they're all going to be, towards the beginning, they're all going to be these really obscure female nude structures or sculptures. Sorry, and once again, we're gonna have the triangle to represent the woman. There's going to be breasts. There's going to be the arms overlapping. Now, this one in particular overlaps the abdomen, which is interesting. If you remember the woman of Venendorf, she actually had her breasts cupping over, or her arms cupping over her breasts. Now, this one could be, again, a relationship to pregnancy or bearing children. The really interesting thing, though, about these Cycladic female figures is that they were actually painted. So, the anatomical and three-dimensional structure wasn't really the emphasis of these little figures. It was more the painting. Now, the painting, as other ones have shown, there were a lot of eyes painted all over, and the painting was very asymmetric, whereas the figures are commonly symmetrical. A lot of historians believe that the eyes throughout the body being painted was either ceremonial painting, perhaps tattoos, or it could even represent healing powers. So they would put an eye in an area where they wanted to be healed. So it's kind of interesting because, you know, the ancient Egyptians had this sort of romantic but yet realistic kind of figures. And then as we move into the ancient Greeks in the beginning, it's very similar to Paleolithic figures that we saw. So, fast forward a bit, in the ancient Greek world, we see a huge shift in the human body and art. This is probably the biggest shifts that we're going to observe. One of the biggest. And, you know, coming from a sculpture that looks like it's from the Paleolithic period, and now to this sculpture that could be borderline Renaissance in a way. This was from, it comes from one of the temples, and actually it's depicting one of the battles of Troy. And Athena is actually leading the army in the center. But that being said, it's interesting because these warriors, the one that I actually have, it's called Warrior Dying. There's actually a couple of them dying, but this one in particular, it's interesting to look at because the body has now taken on reality. The muscles have been chiseled out in the marble. They're defined. They're there. It's much more realistic. It's they're observing the human body, and it's no longer taking on a function. It's still telling a story, but it's no longer that is its only purpose now. Its only purpose is to be a narrative, to be a representation, and to be sort of a decoration. And as it becomes a decoration, it becomes more realistic. They take more time, more care into the symbolism, much like how the Egyptian Ka statues were much more in depth. So the interesting thing about this figure, though, is when we shift later on into the classical Greek or ancient Greek, the sculptures are going to change drastically. And I want to really point out and emphasize on this one the smile that he has on, the face that he is wearing as he dies. And like he's definitely dying. He's got an arrow through him. He's ready to pull it out. He's in pain. His arm is what's holding him up. But somehow he's still smiling. And that's very, very interesting to observe the sort of expressions of the sculptures. And as we look at other Greek sculptures from this time period, the face is going to be kind of what gives away what time period it comes from, because the body structure has now been defined. It has now been explored in depth and can now be recreated in this idealistic, masculine, muscular, or even feminine, but still built body. There's no longer this basic geometry. It is no longer depending on just the paint job. Although they did still paint these figures, that is not the focal point. The focal point has shifted not to a relationship with the body, but an actual representation of the body. So there's a lot going on in this slide. And the reason why is because part of it is I want to show kind of the reference between Egyptian work. I'm always going to bring back and forth between other civilizations, other time periods, and just kind of show the communication that's happening at the time. Whereas on the other side, it's a female and a male, and that's that's mostly because the female, which were actually called kore instead of koros, the koros represents the man, which is in the center, but the kore were always goddesses. They always represent a goddess, and they're always clothed. The koros, those are the men, and they're always nude. I don't know why, but they're always nude. And they represent gods, warriors. A possibility is actually that they represent ancestors as well, which again could be linked back to the Egyptian of the afterlife and the Ka. But not necessarily. But going back to the Egyptian, if you look at them, they're both have the foot forward. They're both in this very sturdy, structured kind of stance. And the bodies are also both kind of this idealized representation of the human body. And they're trying to be more accurate, they're trying to be more realistic. But once again, if you look at that face, it has that ancient Greek grin on its face. Little bit unsettling, but it is very dominant of that time period. So it went from being very similar to the Paleolithic structures to being similar to the ancient Greek work, which was happening around the same time, and it's going to shift to its own kind of standpoint on the human body, and that's actually going to be probably the Hellenistic period is going to be the most interesting period in regards to recording of the human body. Here we see it trying to be realistic, it trying to represent muscles and structure, but it's going to really shift from being idealistic or romanticizing of it to a very realistic representation. The Hellenistic period for the ancient Greeks is actually very important. It changes not only in style, but it also changes in subject matter, it changes in formatting, it changes in the fact that it's going from idealistic to completely personalized. It represents the individual instead of representing this sort of dreamlike state. It's no longer symbolic, but it is symbolic. It takes on the everyday individual and creates a drama from that scene. This is the Market Woman, which is actually a sculpture from the Hellenistic period, and the biggest thing about the Hellenistic period is that you're seeing wrinkles, you're seeing age, you're seeing motion, lots of drapery, the dramatic poses, and it's not just, I mean, they're not just looking at everyday people, although that is the main focus. They also have representations, most people might know, like Nike, the goddess of victory. She's actually also from the Hellenistic period, which is demonstrated in her dramatic pose and also in her long drapery. Unlike the Market Woman, who's very old and very worn out in a way, Nike is obviously, once again, idealized, but again, in the Hellenistic period, we see this shift, this change. They're clothed, they're no longer nude, although some are partially nude. Most of the time they are clothed. We're not really seeing the body and the muscles, but we still see the human body under the drapery. That subtlety of just the leg and the knee coming forward with the drapery around it, and the fact that you can see her body and that structure and almost imagine a physical human being under the clothing is what really dramatizes the sort of Hellenistic time period. So now we're going to shift into the Etruscan and the ancient Roman art. And just some backstory about the Etruscans. So the Etruscans were actually in what's nowadays known as Italy. They were the natives, and then the Romans kind of came in and were like, "Hey, we're gonna conquer all of you and enslave you, and yay!" So the Etruscans became enslaved. Eventually, the Romans were like, "We actually really like you," so a lot of them became free, and then they intermingled. What actually happened is that the Etruscans were declared Romans eventually during the time period later on in ancient Roman history, and they sort of just became Romans. They intermingled, and we don't really know what happened to Etruscans. Their culture just completely died out because they were enslaved, and then they were declared Romans. Um, but a lot of what we do know about Etruscan culture comes back again from their art. And here is an instance where Etruscan art is very similar to Egyptian art. And that is regards because what we're looking at right here is actually a sarcophagus. So much like the Egyptians, the Etruscans also had sarcophagi and sort of this mummification process. Not really mummification for the Etruscans, because they didn't believe in Ka or the life afterwards, in the same regards, but they did have these elaborate tombs in which the bodies would be put in. Now, the tombs, interestingly enough, were always depicting the body in the eating stance. So the Etruscans, what they would do is they would actually lay down on a couch and or a recliner, but this like lounge chair, and they would eat. Now, the Etruscans, just a little interesting fact is that the Etruscans actually valued their women just as much as their men. They were considered equal. So the women and the men were both in the courts. They were both making laws. And oftentimes on the sarcophagi, you'll see a man and a woman lounging together. Now, the ancient Greeks, they did not view women the same way. So when they actually first encountered Etruscans, they were horrified. Now, the Etruscans and the Romans very much so respected the Greeks, but the Etruscans were like, "You're doing this wrong." And the Greeks were like, "Oh, no, we can't have our women in our laws. That's ridiculous." So they kind of like clash heads. So the Etruscan artwork doesn't actually take a lot of influence from the Greek world because of that sort of clashing heads. Whereas the Romans, who really felt inspired by the Greeks, they're going to take on a lot of sort of mixing of the Hellenistic and the early classical works of the Greek world. Now, once again, the Etruscans and the Greeks did interact, so although they didn't quite enjoy each other's company, they still did take some influences. Now, here is Apollo, a Greek god, and they do take over they adapt to their gods. But also, if you look at this structure, it has the early classical smile. Remember how I kept pointing out that smile, that eerie smirk that they all kind of had, even the dying warrior. This again has that smirk. Now the difference here is that they actually clothe their sculptures of gods and significant figures, and they try to. You'll see that there's also still a stylistic aspect while also being realistic or attempting to be realistic, and you do see the muscles, and particularly within the leg. And once again, within focusing on those legs, we see that Egyptian first step forward kind of mimicry that's going on. This movement that started with the Egyptians, and we can see throughout all of these ancient civilizations is a continued sort of format. However, with the Etruscan sculpture, we see his arms are away from his body. He's not rigid and structured. He's much more free in his movement, which unfortunately causes a lot of breakage with sculptures. But there is a difference in the treatment of the human body within these sculptures. There is a different style within representing the human body within these sculptures. And each civilization, although it's adapting from or taking from each other, it's also adapting into its own aesthetic, its own symbolism, and its own sort of culture, because the Etruscans were a freer culture. Well, the Greeks were very free, and so were the Egyptians in a way, but the Etruscans were very much so more relaxed in their sort of lawmaking and culture, and you see that within the sculptures of the people by how their bodies are much more open. So, to better understand the sculpture Augustus of Prima Porta, which is actually we've moved away from Etruscan, now we're into the Roman era. But to better understand it, we have to go back to the Greek, ancient Greek civilization, and that's actually going to bring me to Polykleitos, which is on the left, and that sculpture. Again, it was an ancient Greek. It sort of it's what started the canon, which is actually Greek for measures, rules, or laws, which I keep bringing up, and it's because a lot of the ancient works had a set of laws for their sculptures. So this one it's interesting because the Greek one was what really started sort of the ancient Greek movement into the Hellenistic. And it's very important because the Roman sculptures will actually take on that canon. So what that canon really is, it's a system of ratios between basic units and lengths of various body parts. So some studies suggest that the units have actually been based on the length of the index finger, and the width of the hand across the knuckles. Others suggest that it's the height of the head from the chin to the hairline. It's just different relationships of the body parts to one another. He's supposed to have a spear in his hand, and the sculpture explores not only proportions but also relationships between weight bearing and relaxed legs and arms in perfectly balanced figures. So the cross balance is actually, it's really interesting. If you look at the way that his hip is shifted and the way that his leg is bent and where his shoulders are, he almost makes like an S curve. And this is actually referred to as contrapposto. Or contrapposto. And if we see it, if we look at this sculpture with the contrapposto and we look at the Roman sculpture, we can see that bent leg. We can see how his arms are shifted, how one is bent. We see that contrapposto coming up again in the Roman sculptures. We see how the body is sort of taking on this canon, and how it's not just Greek canon anymore, but also now has been adapted as Roman canon, just like how the Etruscans and the early ancient Greeks kind of adapted the canon of Egyptian art. So it's all overlapping from ancient civilization to ancient civilization, and it revolves around the pose. But if you notice, the Roman sculpture once again, it's clothed, whereas the Greek one is nude. So now the Greeks really felt like the ideal male figure was the perfect human form, and it was sort of this magnificent thing to awe at. But the Roman emperor, he was not depicted nude. He was actually depicted clothed, and on his clothing, on the breastplate, it actually shows the story of a victory. It also has the sun god and Apollo, and also an earth god on there. And the Cupid that's actually tugging at him by his leg, if you notice it, it's because Augustus claimed that he was from divine lineage. So he basically said, if you go back and trace my roots, I actually come from Venus. And Cupid is a child of Venus. So he's basically saying, I am divine. And he's pointing to show that he will guide the rule of Rome. And so he will divinely guide the rule of Rome using Greek methods, which is why again he's taking that Greek contrapposto stand, and he's actually barefoot because this was constructed. It's believed that it was constructed after he had passed. So basically, this is saying that he has already moved on, which is interesting to see because if he had already moved on and he's guiding Rome into the future, it's an interesting kind of contradiction. But the figure itself is again in a very realistic way, but also in a very idealistic way. He's represented in his youth, which if this was actually created after he had passed, he wouldn't look so young. He'd actually be a rather old man. And, you know, it just goes to show that he's taking a lot more, or the artist is taking a lot more from the classical time period of the ancient Greek work, not from the Hellenistic or from pre-classical. He's taking it from what's referred to as the golden age of the Greek art world. As we continue forward in the Roman period, you may think that this bust of a middle-aged woman is actually reminiscent of the Hellenistic period. However, what's really interesting about the Roman time is that they actually very much so valued age. They saw age as sort of this holding of wisdom and a sign of a well-lived life. So this woman's bust, although a lot of busts back then and sculptures were depicting of youth and vitality, this one depicts wisdom. And the woman who commissioned it or paid for it wanted to be shown as a wise and valuable member of society instead of a young, youthful individual. So the wrinkles and the aging might even be exaggerated in a way. She might even not have been this old, but because she wanted to be depicted in a respectful manner, she is shown with age. So we're going to head into early Asian work now, and early Asian work, the human body takes on a different role. It's represented differently, not only because it's mostly representing Buddha, because Buddhism is a huge part in the Asian culture at this time, but also because it has its own style. You don't really see much influence or any influence from the Egyptians, which was kind of demonstrated throughout both the Greek and the Roman and Etruscan, And you don't see any of the classical Greek, you don't see any of that coming through. What you can kind of see is a similarity between early Asian work and Etruscan work because of that freedom and that flexibility and the release of that canon from the Egyptians and Roman and Greek. But in particular, there's a lot more significance into the role of religion within the sculpture and the role of the belief system coming through, not only through the human body, but also through symbolisms throughout around it. Now, Buddhist sculptures, they actually specifically have, or Buddha sculptures have 32 physical attributes that are demonstrated throughout all of them. So these particular parts of the body is really significant for the figure that it's representing. So among them, there's the Lakshanas, which is, and then you have the Ushnisha, which is actually the top, which it's kind of like the hair of Buddha, and it's often pearled-like. And we also have the Uma, which is in between the eyes. It's the third eye in a way. It's between the eyebrows. There's elongated earlobes, spoked circles with so the spoked circles are actually the chakras, and the chakras are on the soles of the feet. So the feet that are turned up, you can't really see in this picture, but there's actually carved spoked circles inside of that, and that it symbolizes both the various states of existence, so basically the wheel of life, but also the Buddhist doctrine for the wheel of life, and the meaning depends on the number of spokes. So that's constantly changing. And there's also significant hand gestures that signify different states of being. So joined hands in the lap, it's a gesture of meditation and balance. It symbolizes the path towards enlightenment. The open palmed gesture is this have no fear. It's conveying a reassurance, blessing, and protection. And then there's also the pose for intellectual debate, which is very interesting. And those are actually the hands coming together, folded in a different way. So from looking at this one in particular, this one is actually saying that not only are the hands within the lap, which is, well, one hand within the lap, but it also has the open palm, which is conveying reassurance, blessing, and protection. So the way that the body is posed, not so much how it is created or represented, but the way that the body is posed also has a deeper meaning. And now the ancient Egyptian work that had both function and religious value. The Greek work was also religious, but it was more decorative, and the Roman work was not religious per se, but decorative and symbolic. Here we have symbolism, we have representation. We do not have a function like the Egyptians. Again, much like the Romans and the Greeks and the Etruscans, this really doesn't hold a function. It's more decorative and to portray the meaning and the symbolism, like I said, with the structure of the palm facing out, to give a blessing. It's not to hold something. It's not to be used as funerary purposes. It is a statue of Buddha that is giving a blessing. So in a way it is holding a purpose, but it's holding a religious purpose. So here we're going to shift over into India. I know I started over with China, but I'm kind of moving along. But uh, over in India, instead of Buddhism, Hinduism was and still is very dominant religion. And um, this in particular, this comes from a temple, and it is depicting Shiva. Now, Shiva is the Lord. Just a little backstory, but Shiva is the Lord of existence, both creative and destructive, light and dark, male and female. And the it symbolizes is its power and creative energy is often represented as the Lord of the Dance. So, dancing within a ring of fire is the endless cycle of death and rebirth, destruction and creation. So this is kind of what's known for the representation of Shiva. Now, what's interesting here is that in this representation, we see again the elongated earlobes, and we see this sort of different depiction of the human body. Um, it's no longer young, but sort of frozen in this unknowing state of age. We don't really know. This isn't an old face. We definitely know that, but it's definitely not almost childlike, like the Greeks' early sculptures. Those were definitely very young men, and this really focuses more on the actual God and depicting of the God and the symbolism of the God and even the garb and everything that's around it. Just that's the focal point. The body is almost like another symbol or representation of the God. It's no longer about trying to create a canon. Like the Buddhist sculpture has its own canon. The Egyptian sculpture has its own canon. The Greek sculpture has its own canon. This time, a lot of the Hindu sculptures that we find are actually really specific from god to god or goddess to goddess or god to goddess. Each one is treated differently to represent the being that it is trying to portray, which is really fascinating. So this is actually a Korean take on the on Buddha, and it's really interesting because well, China brought over Buddhism to Korea, and Korea originally, when they were making Buddhist sculptures, were very similar to Chinese Buddhist sculptures. But if you notice with this one, there's a lot of differences. Also, the drapery and clothing has changed dramatically on it. The figure is much more slender, and the positioning of the body is much more relaxed. We're not seeing the lapping of the legs. We're not looking at the chakra carved into the foot. We're actually seeing it in meditation, but again, I mean, some of the things do follow through, like the hand up is to represent a blessing, the hand in the lap, you know, the different way that the body is structured, it does follow through with some of the Chinese traditions or canon for the body. However, the Koreans, they really took on their own representation of Buddha, and actually it becomes an influence for Chinese sculptures, or not Chinese, sorry, Japanese sculptures as well. Japan will adapt this same kind of format that Korea develops later on. So these little figures, it's actually really interesting. They come from Japan. Now, Japan took a lot of influence from Korea. So Egypt influenced Greek and Roman and some Etruscan art, and then China kind of tried to influence Korea. And in the beginning they did, but Korea kind of developed its own style, and Korea influenced Japan. Now, India was kind of on its own canon and its own kind of influence for art. But going back to Japan, Japan was very influenced by Korea in the artistic style. However, these little figures are actually unique to Japan. Now, there's many theories concerning the functions of the Haningwa, but the figures have been served for, they've been linked between what they think is sort of a ritual or a religious icon joining the afterlife or the dead to the living. Sort of to help join together the world of the living in which the dead could be viewed. A lot of the figures have been identified as seated female shaman, or of men, horses, all kinds of things. And they believe that the shaman could speak directly between the living and the dead. Which is why seeing a lot of them represent female or male shaman, they think that there is a link between the living and the dead with these pieces, and having them been by funerary sites, that also helps the theory of them being a sort of communication for the two. And what helps identify them as shaman is the robes, the belt, a necklace. A lot of times they'll be carrying a mirror. And the shaman, they acted as agents between the natural and the supernatural worlds. So it wasn't just like the living and the dead. They believed in a lot of different mythology, like most ancient cultures did. And the shaman played an important role linking the two. And these pieces were sort of like a conduit or another way to link the two worlds. So that's it for the ancient worlds. I know I jumped around a lot, and it was kind of a little bit chaotic towards the end. But it's really, a lot of this is just kind of to summarize everything and to help later on when a lot of the artists who are focusing on the body and looking at the body, they go back to these roots. They'll be influenced by these kind of canons that came before. And they're going to use it and manipulate it and rework it and reevaluate it and make the work that we know of today. And it's going to be interesting to see the shift in, which we're already starting to see, as the work goes from holding a purpose for the body and with the body to having a religious purpose and a decorative purpose. And as we move over into the early Byzantine and works up to the Renaissance, you're going to see a lot more religious influence, but also way more decorative influence. It's going to hold a purpose to tell a story, yes, which is very consistent throughout history of art, that artwork will almost always be a narrative until modern art. But even modern art tells a narrative. And that's referred to as the master narrative, which I'll get into much later. But the work is going to shift. And I'm going to kind of fast pace it a little bit, and then once we get on to the works that are more body-based, that's that's when I'm going to slow it down a bit. And we're actually going to take time to focus in on that.